So we're continuing on by looking at Simon Blackburn's book, Ethics, a very short introduction, and we're basically concerned with the end of this book, in which he analyzes some problems for ethics as a whole, some things that might undermine our ability to know what's moral, some ideas, arguments that undermine our ability to do good things, perhaps, to praise others, and, as we'll see, some things that might imply that we might not have the control over our actions like we think we do. So we're going to be looking at some of those ideas today. Last time, we looked at 3 threats to ethics. Can anybody remember what those were? What were the 3 threats that we looked at? Yeah.
Death of God.
Death of God? Okay, and what was that? Could somebody summarize it? I know it's kind of a tricky, complex idea. It was something that was heralded by Friedrich Nietzsche in his books. Yeah, you want to take a shot at it?
The collapse of religion.
Yeah. One aspect is the collapse of faith in Christianity, for sure. The collapse in trust of what you might call
meta-narratives which undergird Western society. Those fundamental ideas and standards on which Western society is based, Christianity being one of them. And maybe more generally we could say collapse of trust in the ability of humans to actually figure out what reality is like, and more so the idea that there is an actual world to be interpreted and understood. Yeah. Okay, what was the second threat that we looked at? Yeah. Relativism. And what is relativism? Any idea?
There's no moral disagreements and not a right answer when it comes to ethics, and no one can rightfully judge another person or culture's actions.
Right. Those were some of the implications that followed from it. Remember, moral relativism is the view that there isn't an objective standard of right and wrong that we're all beholden to. And if that's true, the fallout of that is, it wouldn't seem like anybody's having any moral disagreements, because everybody's just saying, murder's wrong, according to my standard. So nobody's really disagreeing. Another one is, it kind of undermines our ability to judge other people's actions and other cultures' actions. If it's right for them, what can you say about it? You just have to say, well, they do things differently over there. Right? Yeah. And then what was the third threat? Yes? Egoism. And could you describe what that is?
Logical egoism implies here altruism is impossible. It's hard to motivate people to be good.
Right. Again, those were some of the implications that followed from what is known as psychological egoism. And this is the view that at bottom, everybody's basically doing what they're doing out of self-interest. If that's true, then it might imply that, nobody is really altruistic. People can't be altruistic because everything that they're doing is just fundamentally motivated out of self-interest. Right. So we looked at those 3 threats, on Tuesday. Today we're going to look at 4 more threats to ethics. And these ones are perhaps taken more seriously in moral discussions and research into ethical theory. The first one is a feature of the contemporary scientific worldview. Now, I want to reiterate that when I'm bringing all of this stuff up to you, I'm not trying to convince you that these ideas are right or wrong. I'm just trying to introduce you to them, right? So I'm not going to be arguing whether or not evolution is right or wrong here. What I'm doing is I'm hoping to explain to you that if it is true, that might imply some things that undermine our ability to be ethical people. So the first one we're going to look today at is evolutionary theory. What is evolutionary theory? Well, it's a theory that was kind of pioneered and popularized by Charles Darwin. The general idea being that organisms adapt to their environment over time, natural selection weeding out those who have poor mutations relative to the environment that they live in. So animals evolve over time, and these adaptations are the result of them interfacing with their environment for survival, right? The organisms that have adaptations, genes that help them survive, are the ones that pass on their genes to the next generation. Well, this is a primary feature of what we might call the contemporary scientific worldview. The contemporary scientific worldview states that the origin of time and space in our universe is the Big Bang. The initial conditions of the Big Bang is what has configured what is around today. The contemporary scientific worldview espouses often the theory of evolution, the idea that all organisms on Earth have a common ancestor in single-celled organisms, right? And evolved over time and split off, all of that stuff. And the contemporary scientific worldview is generally what we would call materialistic and reductionistic. These are fancy philosophical words for saying basically all that exists in the universe is matter and energy. There are no gods, angels, demons, ghosts, spirits. And fundamentally, we can explain all phenomena by recourse to the laws of nature, biochemical reactions, etc. And that all of this stuff is undergirded by matter, atoms, and molecules and stuff. Well, we're going to focus on one aspect of this view today, which is evolutionary theory. If evolutionary theory is true, and we are the products of millions of years of evolution, then it may suggest that our good qualities, dispositions, and behaviors are just adaptations to the environment. So another way of putting this is the reason why you have the level of impulse control that you do that is based on your genes, your tendency to share with others perhaps that is genetic, all of these features of you that are based in biology, if they are the product of evolution, it might imply this problem that we've already looked at, that psychological egoism is true. Why? Well, it's organisms that survive, that were able to pass on their genes. Since we are the product of this long chain of reproduction, we might expect that the genes that we have, that were selected for, are ones that are fundamentally aimed at self-interest. The survival of the individual organism, reproduction, that kind of stuff. So the first thing that evolutionary theory may suggest is this threat that we've already looked at, that psychological egoism is true. This is not a knockdown, drag-out argument against the possibility for ethical behavior, but it's one that would require us to reform some of our moral behaviors and our moral practices. But that's not all. Evolutionary theory also has some other implications for ethics if it's true. It may also suggest that all of those things that we already mentioned, our good qualities, dispositions, and behaviors, aren't good in and of themselves, and that what we might call true moral action doesn't really exist. In other words, evolutionary theory might suggest that there is no such thing as moral action really. Why? Well, if the way that you think about the world, the way that you act in the world, if all of that is genetic, if it's just based in your biology, then that's like just what you're doing, right? You're just like an organism, a creature like anything else. Generally, we don't think that animals have the ability to be moral or immoral, right? Animals are just doing what they're doing because, well, they've evolved that way, right? So maybe the same thing holds true for humans. Maybe it doesn't make sense to talk about moral action insofar as we're just creatures like anything else. And we're just doing naturally what we've evolved to do. I'm linking this back up again with the idea that, if animals aren't moral creatures and maybe we're just intelligent animals, maybe there isn't a thing called morality. Or maybe, there just isn't such a thing. We don't have to talk about morality necessarily, the subjective standard, but maybe there's just no such thing as moral action as we conceive it. These two threats are a little bit ambiguous, that are a little bit abstract. The next two that I'm going to share with you are more serious, I would say. So let's talk about them. The third thing that evolutionary theory may suggest is that we have no way of knowing what is ultimately moral in the first place. That is, it may suggest that our evolutionary history undermines our ability to know what is right and wrong. Put another way, if all of your reasoning faculties, how you think about things, the way that you interpret the world, are just evolutionary adaptations that are based in survival, the things that were best for your ancestors that allowed them to survive, it would be a coincidence that what you think is true about the world lines up perfectly with what would allow you to best survive in the world. Because these things are two different things, right? Another way of putting this is, if the way that we conceive and think about the world is an evolutionary adaptation, it would be a coincidence that we have come to the correct moral beliefs, given that our evolutionary history isn't geared towards understanding the world, but surviving in the world. That's the primary frame within which these adaptations are taking place. This argument is talked about by a philosopher named Sharon Street in one of her articles. Here's a quote from another philosopher, Mailer, talking about this argument. Here is Street's argument. Human systems of moral evaluative judgments are thoroughly saturated with evolutionary influence because natural selection has shaped human psychological dispositions. In other words, the way that your brain works is the product of evolution. Natural selection selected for those moral evaluative judgments according to biological fitness, rather than tracking moral truths of the realist kind. Put another way, the reason why you see the world the way that you do, all of the psychological machinery in your brain, that's the product of an evolutionary history that's geared towards survival, not necessarily apprehending the truth. Okay, these are two different things. If human moral beliefs shaped by evolution align with moral truths, then this would be sheer coincidence. We are not justified in thinking such a coincidence has occurred, so we cannot justifiably believe that our moral beliefs accurately represent independent moral truths. So do you all see what the general argument is here? Put another way, it's this. Our ability to reason, think, perceive, and interpret the world is an evolutionary adaptation or set of adaptations. If that's true, that would seem to undermine our ability to actually know what this objective standard of morality is. Because it doesn't seem like this objective standard is baked into nature, like the environments that we are adapting to. So it would be sheer coincidence if our worldviews actually matched up with this objective moral standard. In other words, it would seem evolutionary theory suggests that we have good reason to believe we don't actually know what's right and wrong. We have good reason to believe that what we think is right and wrong actually aligns up with what is actually right and wrong. So, moral realism must invariably give way to moral skepticism. This is a problematic argument. You really should meditate on this in order to understand its profundity. If it's true that we are just intelligent animals that have evolved over millions of years to our environment, and what shaped those mutations was how well we were biologically fitted, it would be strange that our beliefs about what is moral in today's day and age actually lines up with what is actually right and wrong. Given that the way that we think about the world isn't geared towards truth necessarily, it's geared towards survival and reproduction. Do you all understand the point here? It's a very complex argument, but this is a deep problem for ethics. To summarize it once more, to put it perhaps in more accessible language, evolutionary theory may suggest that we do not have the knowledge of what's right and wrong that we think we do. We don't have good reason to believe that we can figure out what's right and wrong. Thus, here's what Mailer says about this argument. Notice that Street does not try to argue against the existence of moral truths. Instead, she takes a more epistemological tact, that is, based in knowledge, having to do with knowledge. Arguing instead that because the pervasive influence of evolution on our psychology, which supposedly leads to moral beliefs, we should not have very much confidence that our moral beliefs have tracked moral truths, that they line up. We can imagine, for instance, that moral truths are kites, and the string which leads from the kite to our hand is our ability to, quite literally, grasp the truth. Street's argument is that even if there are moral truths flying up there, we have no good reason to think that the string we now hold is actually attached to a moral kite, as opposed to an immoral vulture or whatever else is flying above us. So Street grants that there might be moral truths up there, there might be an objective standard of right and wrong, but who really knows? Barring some kind of special revelation, the moral realist seems to be flightless. So it would seem like evolutionary theory suggests we don't have the ability, perhaps, to figure out what is right and wrong like we think we do. So this is a serious problem, okay? If it's true that our psychology has been shaped by evolution, that gives us a reason to suspect that the moral beliefs that we have might not actually line up with what's right and wrong. I would encourage you all to kind of think about this argument. This is an interesting argument. Taken to its logical conclusion, it might suggest that we actually don't have the ability to figure out the way the universe works in any domain the way that we think we do. Because our psychology is adapted to survival, not necessarily the apprehension of truth. Right? These two things are different. Finally, and this is going to lead into our next threat, evolutionary theory may suggest a kind of genetic determinism. Maybe. Not a lot of people believe this, but this is an idea that could be on the table. That is, it may suggest that humans are simply programmed to think and behave in a certain way because of our genes. In other words, it may suggest that we don't have the control over our thoughts and actions that we think we do. Genes are basically driving everything. Genes are kind of driving why you interact in the world the way you do, why you think the way you do, what you say in some fundamental sense. So, evolutionary theory might suggest that we don't have the control over our actions that we think we do that would be necessary for morality. Does this one make sense? Y'all understand what this is getting at? This is an argument that is not extremely widespread, but again, it's an idea that's on the table that we'll be considering. Perhaps a stronger version of this argument lies in the next threat that Blackburn discusses, and that is the threat of determinism. Think about the contemporary scientific worldview that is given to us, in which all of this stuff is just matter and energy. All of this stuff is governed by natural and physical laws of the universe, right? Can't go faster than the speed of light. When you drop something, it's going to fall because of the law of gravity, right? Electrons and protons attract because they're dissimilar charges. Similar charges repel. These are all how natural phenomena behave. Ever since thinkers, scientists, philosophers have been engaged in the project of natural science, they've come to believe that the universe operates according to certain law-like ways. This is what our experience suggests, right? If I drop this, what's going to happen to it? Oh, look at that, it fell. If I drop it again, what's going to happen to it? Is it going to shoot up into the sky?
Maybe, probably not.
Oh, look at that, it fell again, right? So, for centuries, there's been this idea that the universe behaves according to certain laws, in ordered ways. Along with this idea arose a view known as atomic materialism, which is everything in the universe is just made of atoms, and what we now know are like subatomic particles as well. If all of this stuff is just made of atoms, if all of this stuff is matter just behaving in law-like ways, what would that suggest about the universe? Well, it might suggest a few things. One of them might be, insofar as we're just made of atoms, natural things, you could say the human being is just something like a very complex machine that's operating according to certain physical laws. There are chemical reactions going on in your brain that always go the same way because, natural phenomena don't just spontaneously change their behavior, right? There's certain things going on in your brain, in your body. Related to this is the threat of determinism, which is bound up with this contemporary scientific view. Determinism is the view that events in the universe are completely determined by previously existing causes. So, the contemporary scientific worldview, for example, would suggest that the origin of time and space in our universe was the Big Bang. What the initial conditions of the Big Bang were basically has resulted in what we see today. So if the particles or if the energy distribution was different, things would be different today. Right? Basically, determinism suggests that everything that happens in the universe, you can imagine events as being like dominoes all lined up. One thing happens, that causes another thing to happen, that causes another thing to happen, and there's just this long chain of causes. So the reason why you're here today is because, well, a whole set of things caused you to be here. What caused that thing to happen? Well, the way that the universe was before that moment caused that thing to happen. Stretching all the way back to the origin of the universe. Determinism may suggest that the way humans behave, the way nature unfolds, the way galaxies are formed, the way that everything goes in the universe is determined by, well, what the laws of nature are, what all the different places in space are of these different molecules and atoms. Things that don't have a will of their own, right? An atom can't just fly off where it wants. It's pushed and pulled by what's happening around it and the forces in the fields around it. And so this suggests something problematic, okay? If it's true that all events in the universe are completely determined by pre-existing causes, then that would suggest humans don't really have free will. Insofar as, we are just things made of matter and energy, determined by the laws of nature and the laws of physics. There are atoms and molecules doing things in your body you can't control. The reason why you have certain moods or certain feelings is just because of brain stuff that's going on. If all that is true, it would suggest you don't really have any control over what happens in your life, over what you do. Because you are just a composite of these atoms. So do you see the general point? If everything is physical, made of matter and energy, and they're bound by these laws of nature, and you're just made of atoms, matter and energy, how could you really have control over what you do or what you think? This is a problem for ethics, because we generally presuppose that in order for anybody to be morally responsible for anything, they have to have some sort of control over their actions, right? Or you could say they must have had the ability to do otherwise. But if we don't have control over our actions, and if we're just doing what we're doing because of the way things were, causing us to do what we're doing now, that would suggest that nobody can be morally responsible for anything. Because we are all just determined to do what we do based on what has happened in the past. Based on how atoms are flying, how all these different chemical reactions are occurring, etc. So, determinism may suggest humans don't have free will. If humans don't have free will, humans don't have control over what they do. If humans don't have control over what they do, they can't be morally responsible for anything. Does this idea make sense? Imagine this scenario. I kidnap you after class, and I'm a brilliant neurosurgeon, and so I implant a little device in your brain with a controller that causes you to jerk your arm in a certain way. And then I set you loose, and you're walking by, somebody on campus, and I press the button and you smack them, right? You didn't do that on purpose. That was because of the thing I implanted in your brain. You smacked somebody. Would you be morally responsible for that? People would generally say no, right? Because I implanted a device in your brain that made you do that. You didn't have control over your arm. It just shot out, right? There's a similar idea going on here. We think that you're not morally responsible in that example because you don't really have control over what you do. Determinism would suggest that basically what we're thinking and doing is based on stuff we don't have control over.
No, I really can't imagine atoms having the ability to reason.
They don't. Yeah, that's true.
Yes, I really can't say I agree with this whole determinism thing.
That a lot of people don't. A lot of people do not think the universe is deterministic in this way. Yeah, and some people actually try to redefine free will in a way that is compatible with this view. Those people are called compatibilists. But generally, people who are religious or theological in their reasonings take an incompatibilist position. They think that free will is not compatible with determinism. Determinism is not true, so we have free will. But yeah, it all comes back to, what do you think makes all this stuff up? What do you think you are? If you just think you're some combination of atoms, then that might lead you to think this. But if you think that you have something like a soul or a mind that is distinct from atoms, then you might believe that you have free will. Right? Something that isn't determined by physical processes and causes, but is kind of outside of that. This is an idea people have had for a long time. In any case, the point I want to make here is that the contemporary scientific worldview may suggest that determinism is true. If that's true, that would imply nobody is morally responsible for anything. If nobody is morally responsible for anything, what conclusions can we draw from that?
Perhaps morals have no meaning.
Perhaps it doesn't even make sense to talk about morality.
If there's no control over it, why talk about it?
Right. Our idea of, telling people they should do something or shouldn't do something presupposes the idea that they have a choice in the matter. Right? So maybe if nobody has any free will, there's no such thing as morality that really makes sense. Yeah. Certainly implies that if nobody has control over what they do, it doesn't make sense to judge them, right? Or criticize them, or morally praise or blame them, right? Because they don't have control over their actions. So if this argument is sound, it may imply, nobody's morally responsible for their actions. We cannot justifiably judge people for what they do. You can't judge the murderer for what he did because he was just determined to do that by what was going on in his brain. And the entire history of the universe up until that point is what caused him to do that. Right? And it implies something very dangerous about the way that we have organized society. If nobody has control over their actions and is morally responsible for what they do, what sense does it make to punish people? That would seem to be unfair. Right? If you can't control what you do and you rape and murder someone, what sense does it make to punish you? You didn't have control over your actions on this view. Right? It wouldn't be fair to punish you. Right? Because you had no say in the matter. You had no choice. So that might lead us to think, holy shit, we need to revise our whole criminal justice system if this is true.
Along those lines, though, that punishment would be determined, predisposed by the universe.
Perhaps, yeah. Yeah, maybe we're just determined to punish people. I don't know.
We created the criminal justice system out of what was determined through the universe.
Yeah, that would also be, a thing that's determined. Yeah. But we can say that it's still illogical, perhaps. Or unfair.
Is anything logical at that point, though?
That's another interesting question. If we actually don't have control over how we think, does it make sense to call people rational or irrational? That's another interesting question, because calling somebody rational or irrational, like, oh, you should be rational, seems to imply they have some sort of control over how they think and what they believe. Right? So maybe we'd have to throw the whole concept of rationality out the window too. Yeah.
I feel like
Bless you.
This makes a lot more sense when you look at like history and people through like a dialectical material lens.
Okay.
I feel like it makes a lot more sense that way, and how like people all around us are constantly shaping the world and the world shaping us, and how much are we responsible and free in that.
Okay, yeah, so that's kind of, well, we could call it something like an economic view, right? The material conditions determining how people think, the worldviews that they have, what they think is possible for them in their lives. Yeah, you're thinking of like neo-Marxist stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another deterministic view that you could have. You could think like Marx that really what determines your personality, your life trajectory, is actually, who has access to the means of production, who actually owns resources, who has access to those resources, your class, that kind of stuff. Yeah, that could be another deterministic view. Yeah. So do you see how serious of a problem this is, though? If we don't have free will, we'd have to throw out judging and criticizing people for their actions. We'd have to throw out, perhaps, any practices that punish people. One philosopher has gone so far to argue that not only, do we not have free will, and this is all true, not only should we get rid of punishment, we're actually obligated to engage in what he calls punishment. It's just by sheer bad luck that criminals rape and murder. So we're kind of obligated to make prisons as comfy as we can for them, because they're going to have a shitty life. So we give them Xboxes, we give them TVs and nice beds. What do you think of that? Punishment.
Isn't there a country that does something like that?
There are countries that have better and worse prisons, for sure, and rehabilitation programs. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like that makes sense when you look at like our current system and how like repeat offenders is very common, and it's obviously like you can look at the war on drugs and stuff like that, and it's like obvious that harsh punishments don't work to stop things.
Yeah. I mean, you can look at a lot of the things that people are getting arrested for and disagree that they have done something immoral, and disagree that they've done something that should be considered illegal in the first place, and be like, yeah, we should treat those people better. Yeah, makes sense. So, if it's true that nobody has control over their actions, we would have to revise a lot of our practices, behaviors, ideas. There's another threat to ethics, determinism. Let's look at two more. This is one you're all familiar with, though you probably just haven't thought about it. Aren't you just sick and tired of being held to this standard of behavior that people say that you should, live according to? Oh, people tell you not to lie. They tell you not to cheat. They tell you not to do these things that are immoral. Maybe morality places unreasonable demands on people. Maybe it's way too strict. This is another threat that Blackburn discusses. It has been argued that our systems of morality are just placing too many expectations and demands on people. Because look, there are situations in life where it looks like we should do the immoral thing, and we shouldn't be judged or criticized for that. Like maybe stealing food for your family if you got fired from your job. Or blowing the whistle on a company's practices. One particular example that is often used to critique Kant is what's known as the axe murderer example. What ethical theory did Kant propose? What was it called?
Was he deontology?
Deontology, right, yes. Deon coming from the Greek word duty. Kant thought, look, there are certain things that you should never do because they're always immoral. Cheating, stealing, murdering. And he included lying. He thought that lying was always immoral. And thus comes in the famous axe murderer example. Imagine you're hiding one of your friends in your house. And somebody comes up to your door and they're like, hey, is your friend Bobby in there? He's an axe murderer. He wants to kill Bobby. What would Kant say? You got to tell that guy the truth. You can't lie to him. That's immoral. Doesn't that seem ridiculous? Wouldn't you lie to protect your friend Bobby? So the idea here is that, like, look, sometimes situations require us to do immoral things. Maybe we're just, like, having way too harsh of expectations for people. Morality places unreasonable demands on people, this argument says. Maybe sometimes, it's justified to lie, to steal, to kill, right? Think about war. Think about abortion. People hem and haw about the morality of war and abortion and all this stuff. But look, life is difficult. It's complex. Sometimes we got to do the lesser of two evils. This idea, vibing with anybody? To summarize it better, perhaps we could say, it's argued that ethics is impractical sometimes for daily life. Sometimes our society, our culture, places us in difficult or impossible situations. For example, this is one that you've heard of. There's no ethical consumption under capitalism. If that's true, we're doing immoral things all the time. By buying our nephew, the Nike shoes that he wants. By contributing to our favorite streamer on Twitch. Because Twitch is a corrupt corporation, that's blah, blah, blah. The fact of the matter is, life places us in difficult, impossible situations. Maybe the standards of morality that we have are just too high and we should lower them. What do you think? You feeling this one?
I agree, to a certain degree. I think that there's definitely some circumstances where ethics place unreasonable demands on us. But
like in the axe murderer example?
Yeah, but I still think, if you just didn't think about the ethics or morality or something, I feel like I kind of make decisions when it comes to making a moral decision. I just try to think about who it's going to impact directly or even indirectly, but I don't really think about is this moral, is this not moral? It's just am I hurting anybody? And if the answer is no, then I'll probably just do that.
Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of people do that,
I think I agree with it too. Just how, a lot of times ethics is trying to place these very strict structures in human behavior, which is all over the place.
Yeah.
It creates unreasonable things.
So you would say, yeah, maybe we should relax our standards, or maybe not across the board, but maybe recognize that look, some people are placed in these shitty situations. Don't expect too much from them. Morally speaking. Have some empathy, Yeah. Society is unfair. Life is unfair. Who has status, power, wealth? A lot of that seems to be by chance or luck.
I don't think that means that we should try and give up on being good people, though.
Okay. So, maybe ethics places unreasonable demands on people, but we should still strive for ideal moral behavior.
In most circumstances, I'd say. Like the axe murder, that's a circumstance where the right thing isn't the ethical thing, so to speak.
On Kant's view, yeah.
Yeah. But if you looked at it, say, from the utilitarian view, I think you have to pick and choose what you use.
That's the difficult thing, though, right? If you pick and choose what standard to believe in and use, like, do you really have a standard?
I guess it depends on the person.
You know? Oftentimes, what these philosophers are trying to do is they're trying to describe for us the standard that we're all beholden to. There's an idea that we're beholden to one true objective standard. If you're flip-flopping on what you think is justifiable and unjustifiable, they're going to say, you're being inconsistent, bro. Like, you're just, I don't know, doing what suits you, following your fancy, you know?
I do think, like, yeah, we should still try and live up to, like, certain standards of morality, but, like, I guess my opinion is coming from the fact that, like, I'll recognize that there's people in, like, much less fortunate situations than I am. And I think if you stick, somebody who grew up in poverty, you put them in this class, I don't think they would share the same opinions as many of us at all, just because we come from a different place. And, I think, like, they can kind of do, kind of like what I was saying, what's best for themselves, that's also not hurting anybody else. But, like, I still think they should try to, like, grow through their, they should try to expand their perspective.
Okay.
But, like, they got to take baby steps to get there. I don't think they're just going to be able to flip from not really understanding morality or ethics and then just being able to, like, okay, yeah, this is what I need to do. Like, there's going to be situations where they can't live up to that, and it's just going to put even more stress on them when they're already in a stressful situation.
Sure. Yeah. It's, a lot of what we do is influenced by the kind of resources and past that we have been given. Right? So yeah, that makes sense. In any case, this idea suggests that we're being too strict with people morally. Maybe we should relax our standards. You can think about, which ones we should relax and why, or if we shouldn't relax any.
Maybe we're not being strict enough.
Maybe.
If those people in poverty, say the people in poverty, maybe it's not their fault that they're there. Maybe it's our responsibility to help them.
Okay, yeah. I think a lot of people would agree with that. Yeah.
Perhaps.
Especially the utilitarians, right?
Maybe it's not ethical, like, person to person, but as a group of people.
There is a general idea that is a very widespread opinion today that, yeah, we do have some sort of social obligation to others, a moral obligation to others in society. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the last threat that he mentions. This one is similar to the evolutionary threat that we've already looked at. I've heard that ad plenty of times. This one argues maybe we don't have the moral knowledge that we think we do. Maybe we don't actually know what's right or wrong. And further, maybe our ideas of right and wrong have actually been socialized into us without our knowing, and we are kind of like puppets in somebody else's game. we have been conditioned into having what's known as a false consciousness, a false understanding of our social reality and our place in it, and perhaps what is right and wrong. This idea suggests that, look, we might just be mistaken about what is moral and immoral because we've been educated and socially conditioned to hold certain values and believe certain things. Thus, at the end of the day, it might be impossible for us to know what is really moral, or we may simply be mistaken about it. And there are a bunch of different thinkers throughout history have argued that the education, the body of knowledge that you're given, the way that you're socialized is, well, for a particular narrow purpose that's limited. Okay? For example, you'll hear progressive thinkers today say that we have a false consciousness with respect to oppression. We've been taught that our society is fair, that how people's lives end up are the result of their own actions. And they'll say this is a lie. This isn't true. Our society is not fair. It's not meritocratic. People are being oppressed, and you've been brainwashed into believing that everything is hunky-dory. You can see this in feminist literature, progressive political philosophy. And you'll see people trot out this kind of argument against religion as well. Right? They'll say, oh, you're just a brainwashed religious zealot. You know, you don't really understand what's right and wrong and how reality works. You grew up in a cult or something. Right? So the general idea is we might be mistaken about what is actually right and wrong, but then the further argument is you've been educated and socialized in a certain way to keep you blind from what is actually right and wrong, how society should actually be organized, etc. So here's what Blackburn has to say. A critic may now suggest that ethics as an institution is a system whose real function is other than it seems. A feminist might see it as an instrument of patriarchal oppression. A Marxist can see it as an instrument of class oppression. A Nietzschean may see it as a lie with which the feeble and timid console themselves for their inability to seize life as it should be seized. A modern French philosopher, such as Michel Foucault, can see it as a diffuse exercise of power and control. So I'll just walk through these examples. They're pretty self-explanatory, but again, generally, feminists nowadays will argue that society is constructed in a certain way to limit and oppress women. We're kind of brainwashed into thinking that it's fair and the sexes are equal, but that's not true. A Marxist would say, look, the way everything is organized is actually to keep a certain group in power and to maintain a perpetual working class that basically works for this group. And the working class is blinded by all of the things that they don't have, all of the freedoms that are limited. A Nietzschean would say, for example, when we looked at slave and master morality, that the moral systems that we have today are just tricksy inventions by weak people to gain power and control over the strong people that would dominate them. And he would call Christianity a slave morality like this. And finally, Foucault would say, and this is something which is a central theme in a lot of progressive political theory, that what our society touts as knowledge, what our society claims is the right way to understand how the world works, are instruments of power that those above you are kind of using to control you and enrich their own lives. So you get the general idea, right? Maybe ethics as it has been sold to us, the view of society that we have that has been sold to us is actually just something that other people are using to control us, extract money from us or labor or whatever. This is the threat of false consciousness. So, to reiterate, I bring up all of these ideas not because I'm trying to convince you of them, but because I want to make you aware of, well, what are people saying that might undermine what we've been investigating in this whole class? Right? We've been presuming that there's a fact of the matter about what's right and wrong. We've been presuming that we can figure out what's right and wrong. And we've been presuming that we actually have the ability to be moral people, to do good things. We have control over our actions in this way. All of these threats that we've looked at in the last two classes provide reasons that those presuppositions might not be as strong as we think they are. And so, debates are being had. Do we actually have control over our actions? Is society organized the way that we actually think it is? Is the ethics that has been sold to us, does it actually capture reality? Do we actually have the ability to figure out what's moral or immoral? Or is that impossible for us? So think about these things. These are serious ideas that you should contend with as somebody who wants to live a fulfilled moral life. Right? I take it that you don't want to be assholes, right?
Depends on the day.
Maybe it depends on the person too. But think about it, right? And so here are a few questions to motivate this kind of reflection. Okay? Do you think that we really do have control over our own actions? Given what you understand about the universe, are you just some complex biological animal machine? Or are you something else? Do you actually have the ability to control what you do? Or is it being determined by your genes, by your positionality, your class, by your upbringing, your education, whatever? Because you're going to hear a lot of people say today that, no, you don't really have the correct understanding of how society works. You don't really have the control over your life that you think you do. Right? If you are religiously minded, this is something that I didn't bring up, but it's an interesting idea. You might also think that God's existence undermines humans' ability to freely act. Can anybody think of a reason why God's existence might imply we don't have free will?
He has set rules and regulations.
Perhaps. Yeah. How about this? God knows everything, right? If God knows everything, then God knows what you're going to do. If God knows 100% what you're going to do, can you do otherwise? Does God's foreknowledge imply that we don't actually have the ability to freely choose? Because that would make God wrong, and God's never wrong. Right? That's something to consider. There are arguments that rebut this. I'll let you research those yourself. That'll be a good exercise. So, reflect on, are we the puppets of God, nature, evolution, our own biology, our own psychology? Or do we actually have the ability to better ourselves, to make a difference, to change things? And finally, should we accept the story that the worldview that we've been given is a tool that is being used to oppress or control us? Is that true? Is religion ultimately a tool of social control? Is the belief in rights and meritocracy just a tool of control? These are things worth reflecting on. Okay, I will just ask you one more thing here. What do you think about these threats? Has it caused any of you to, have some uneasy feelings? Or in this brief time period, question your understanding of yourself, your place in society, what you think is actually possible? What do you think? I want to hear what's coming up for y'all.
I think with the puppets thing, I think we're all just really puppets to our access to resources.
Okay.
And what we have, because the more you have, the more leisure time you're going to have, the more access to certain things you're going to have, events, just all these other things that someone who's poor doesn't have.
Okay, so you're like...
I think in modern society, at least, we are puppets to that.
You're partial to the historical materialism of Marx. Okay. Yeah.
I think to a degree, there's limitations to what we can and can't do, but I don't think those can't be broken. I think you just have to be smart and try to learn as much as possible and keep thinking of things you can do to improve your own life.
Okay. So you're not giving up in this idea that, look, we can actually change things and I can actually better my life.
Correct.
And find success.
Yeah.
Okay. I like the optimism. Yeah. I want to believe that too.
No, I think everyone has the tools to succeed. It's just how good are their tools. I might have a hammer while someone else has a power drill, or someone has a bulldozer. We all have the tools to succeed. It's just how much effort we have to put into it to succeed.
Okay. So it sounds like you believe we have some sort of free will, and socially, economically speaking, like you can cultivate some sort of successful life for yourself.
Everyone has the ability to succeed. It's just how much struggle do we have to put into it.
Okay. Yeah, I would definitely agree. We don't all face the same barriers or struggles or difficulties, right? And for some people, it's a lot easier to succeed than others, right? Yeah. Okay. Any final questions, concerns, comments? All right, I'll let you go then. Thank you very much for coming. Don't forget to sign the attendance sheet, and I will see you next week.